Good day, and welcome to the Chesapeake Foodshed Network's virtual Coffee Talk series, An Equal Exchange. My name is Yona Sipos, and I direct program development for the Chesapeake Foodshed Network through Local Concepts, LLC, a consulting firm providing development and backbone support for the CFN. I'm joined today by Christy Gabbard, owner of Local Concepts and CFN Network Director, Liz Spellman, CFN Local Concepts Policy Analyst, and Sonia Kiner, CFN Local Concepts Communications Director. Of course, I am also joined by our resource experts, Lori Beyranavand, Emily Broadleib, and Emma Clippinger, whom we are thrilled to be hosting and we'll get to introduce shortly. We're also thrilled to be joined by some portion of the over 200 folks who have registered from across the US and even from Canada and New Zealand. Welcome to all of you. Today's Coffee Talk webinar launches a new phase of CFN policy programming, which you'll hear more about from Liz, our policy analyst, toward the end of the webinar. Before our main event, I'll provide a very brief overview of the CFN and the Coffee Talks. The mission of the CFN is to catalyze connections and collaborations that build a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, including DC, Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York, and West Virginia. We believe that by catalyzing connections and collaborations, we are better positioned to accelerate change in and across our food system. The main aim of the CFN is to grow connections, get to know one another, share information, knowledge, and experiences to build trust and relationships such that over time, we may align, collaborate, and contribute to collaborative action and collective impact across the watershed. The Chesapeake Foodshed Network has been developing over the last 2.5 years among those out there doing the extraordinary work to advance our regional food system. If you participate in or support that extraordinary work, as well as the vision of a sustainable, resilient, equitable, and inclusive regional food system, please participate in the Chesapeake Foodshed Network. The CFN is open and free of charge to organizations, businesses, funders, agencies, and other change agents working across the Chesapeake watershed to grow a stronger and more resilient food system. Please visit chesapeakefoodshed.net to find out more. Please also note the usernames and hashtags on the slide footers today. Sonia will be live tweeting and would love to see you on Twitter as well as on Facebook, where we are actually live streaming the event. The CFN Coffee Talk programs provide a monthly virtual platform to catalyze connections around specific food system topics. We use webinar and video conference software to connect people from across our region and across the nation. The Coffee Talks provide opportunities for food system changemakers to connect with resource experts for ongoing learning, dialogue, and collaborative action, first through a quick webinar presentation and then through strategies for ongoing involvement, including developing our own follow-up programming, such as the regionally focused video conference that the CFN will host with the Blueprint authors on June 26th. Finally, before introducing the speakers, a few housekeeping items. We're using Zoom software today, and on your Zoom control panel at the base of your screen where you see my video and slides, you should see a chat box. If not, you can take your mouse and hover over the bottom of the screen, and a series of icons should show up. You can open up your chat box and feel free to type in your name, organization, and state. You can introduce yourself and test out the software. During the webinar, we'll also use that space to share some prompts with you. Also on your Zoom control webinar, you should see a Q&A box that once opened, you can type in your questions and comments at any time. Liz Spellman will be collecting your questions and will moderate the Q&A period with the presenters following the presentation. Next week, we will send out a link to the recording, PDF of the slides, follow-up resources, contacts, and a post-webinar survey, which we would really appreciate if you would fill out, and we'll also make that available during the Q&A. Finally, it is now my pleasure to introduce the resource experts and authors of the Blueprint for a National Food Strategy. We are delighted to be hosting Lori Beyranavand, Emily Broadleib, and Emma Clippinger as they showcase their report and help us to begin to dig in. Lori Beyranavand is a professor of law with the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems with the Vermont Law School. Emily Broadleib is Deputy Director of the Harvard Law School Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation and Founding Director of Harvard Law Food Law and Policy Clinic, which I'll note is the first law school clinic in the nation devoted to providing legal and policy solutions to nonprofit and government clients to address health, economic, and environmental challenges facing our food system. Third presenter is Emma Clippinger, a clinical fellow in Harvard Law, Food Law and Policy Clinic, and she will be joining us mostly over chat today. More details on the resource experts and their extensive experience can be found at ChesapeakeFoodshed.net. Welcome to all of our presenters and all of our participants. We are delighted to be sharing this afternoon with you and delighted to be learning from our resource experts today. So Lori, when you're ready, I will be happy to turn this over to you. Thank you all.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for participating, and thank you to Yona, Christy, and Liz, and everyone at the Chesapeake Foodshed Network for inviting us to speak about our work. We're really thrilled to share our work with you, given your experience and expertise, and to contribute to what we hope is the beginning of a national conversation about how we might move towards a national food strategy in the United States. Just to tell you guys a little bit about our work, this report, the Blueprint for a National Food Strategy, was the culmination of a collaborative effort between our two centers over the course of 18 months that was funded by the Kellogg Foundation. The report is available at our website, which Yona has made available and shared with all of you, and I think it's on one of the last slides at the end of our presentation as well, and it can be downloaded at the website. It also has a number of interactive features, so we welcome all of you to interact with the report and to provide feedback so that we can begin to collect that and share it back with everyone. So, as many of you know, or as all of you know, probably food and agriculture are at the center of so many issues in the United States, and the food system itself is at the center of these issues. So to give a few examples, immigration, the environmental protection, public health, the economy, all of these things are both impacted by the food system and impact the food system. And as many of you also probably know, the reach of the food system is incredibly broad. Yet it's pretty rare that we see law and policymakers take into account the food system holistically when they're engaging in decision making that either impacts the food system or may be impacted by the food system. What we hope to do with our project was consider a set of models, both international and domestic, to begin to think about a process where we might address these issues in the United States in a coordinated manner so that we can avoid law and policy making that either acts at cross purposes, is inefficient, or doesn't really produce beneficial outcomes. So as a first matter, there's a number of federal agencies in the United States that touch the food system in some way. And we tried to illustrate for you guys on this slide all the different agencies that might touch the food system, or give you guys examples of the different agencies that might touch the food system, but this doesn't give you the full scope of all the agencies that might play a role in the food system. And also to note that with a few limited exceptions, it's rare that these agencies coordinate their decision making with each other. So the FDA might be making a decision that somehow implicates something that the EPA is doing, and there are certain instances where those two agencies coordinate. There are also a number of instances where those agencies might not coordinate. And in addition, there's a number of different laws and policies in the United States that are at odds with one another or function at cross purposes. So this slide is meant to give an example of the dietary guidelines versus the Farm Bill in the United States. So every 5 years, Health and Human Services and the USDA jointly release the dietary guidelines for Americans. There are certain things that those focus on. They provide both nutrition recommendations for people in the United States, but they also help to guide federal nutrition policy and programs, as well as programs at the state and local levels. The most recent guidelines in the United States heavily emphasize the consumption of fruits and vegetables. Yet, as you can see on the slide, on the picture of Farm Bill spending next to the dietary guidelines image, the bulk of federal subsidies in the United States that are allocated under the Farm Bill support the production of commodity crops such as corn and soy. Those often become components of highly processed and sometimes less healthy foods. And as you can see with the numbers here, the differences in allocations for these federal subsidies are pretty substantial. So 4.3 billion spent on specialty crops versus 33.1 billion spent on commodity crops. Another example is the Food Safety Modernization Act. So in the United States, there are a variety of different federal initiatives that are geared towards shifting federal resources and attempting to support the growth of local and regional food production and food systems. Yet, both Congress, through the passage of FSMA, and the FDA, through the proposed regulations to implement FSMA, threaten the viability of small and mid-sized farms, which would have limited access to local foods. And so what our findings suggested after we engaged in the research to create our report, what our findings suggested was that a national food strategy in the United States could serve to remedy these types of issues and provide not only for greater coordination among all the different agencies that may take actions that impact the food system or are impacted by the food system, but also to coordinate among these different laws and policies to encourage law and policymakers to begin to account for the potential conflicts and trade-offs that might be implicit in their decision making and to develop some sort of framework to prioritize among those. So we focused broadly on two sort of major categories of strategies. The first was we looked at a number of comprehensive national food strategies in the international context to see what we might be able to learn from what other countries were doing with regard to these same issues. But we also looked at a bunch of domestic strategies in the United States that addressed other issues of national concern that are similar, in a sense, to the creation of a national food strategy. What we realized was that other countries that face similar food systems issues to the United States address these issues through the creation of national food strategies similar to what we're suggesting. And in the United States, we've addressed a number of issues of national concern through the creation of national strategies. When I pass this over to Emily, she'll talk to you all about some of those domestic strategies more. With regard to the international strategies, one thing we realized that was interesting to us was that since the mid-1970s, countries have engaged in the process of thinking about the food system and thinking about how do we regulate or develop laws and policies that take into account the food system. And so this slide shows you all the different key plans that we analyzed within the report. So we looked at Australia, Brazil, Norway, Scotland, the United Kingdom, and Wales. That's not to say there aren't food strategies of some type in a number of other countries. We focused on these as comprehensive food strategies. Most of them we chose because they either share similar issues, challenges, and goals to the United States, or because they had some sort of unique attribute that we wanted to highlight in the report and thought was important. Norway we discussed because it represented the first attempt by a country to connect farms, food, and nutrition. Brazil we focused on because it demonstrated an unparalleled commitment to engaging stakeholders and the public as decision makers in the creation of food policy. So I'm going to dig into a couple of these in a minute, but what can we learn from these sort of more broadly? There are a few things that we focused on in the report specifically. So the first was what factors or events might lead a country to develop a national food strategy. And these vary depending on the country, in part depending on whether the country was developed or developing. But some of the major things that we found were that countries focused on public health challenges and how to address those, a declining food and ag sector. Some countries were focused on addressing chronic malnutrition and hunger. And in some instances, countries recognized a similar issue that we face in the United States, which is this lack of coordination, both among agencies, but also among laws and policies related to the food system. The second big thing that we focused on were the strategic objectives. So what strategic objectives did countries choose to focus on in their strategies? And then finally, what methods did they use to elicit stakeholder input during the creation of this strategy? And on this slide, I included one of the graphics from our report, which gives a timeline of Australia's stakeholder engagement process when they created their national food plan. It's pretty similar to a lot of other countries. I'm going to talk with you all or highlight Brazil just because it stands out as a country that did some things pretty different. With regard to objectives or the objectives that a country might choose to focus on, the UK's Food 2030 provides an example of several key objectives that were identified by the UK to be accomplished by the year 2030. And as you can see, those are related to access to healthy and affordable food that's been sustainably produced to conserve resources, but also support rural economies, position the UK as a national leader in the food sustainability context, and also to reduce waste and energy consumption. And then finally, Brazil's national food and nutrition security policy we discussed as an example of how a government can not only hear from stakeholders and incorporate their input, which is sort of the traditional way that governments take into account stakeholder opinions, but Brazil actually incorporated stakeholders as law and policymakers for decisions that are related to the food system. So in Brazil, citizens are able to participate as representatives in councils at the federal, state, and local levels to create and develop food policy. That means, in essence, the public has really strong influence over those decisions. And while we recognize that that's unusual in its approach to incorporating stakeholder engagement, there are aspects of Brazil's stakeholder engagement process that could prove really beneficial and useful in the United States in engaging underserved communities that may not typically have a place at the table in these conversations. So I will turn it over now to Emily to discuss the domestic strategies that we looked at, our findings and recommendations, and how a national food strategy can begin to address some current political goals and priorities.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Lori, for kicking it off. And I'll reiterate the thanks to our friends from the Chesapeake Foodshed Network for putting this together today. We're excited to be talking about this work. It was a kind of a long research project, so I'm going to talk through the second half of the report, but also some other work that we've been doing. And I also want to give a thank you to Emma, who I'll be filling in part of this. She was supposed to present. She was also one of the lead researchers and authors of this project, and sadly has lost her voice, so she's only participating through chat. So I want to talk a little bit about the other half of the research. If you think back to the image that Lori showed of the two types of models that we have. And I'll talk a little bit about the US side of this. So some of you might be surprised to learn that the US already has a lot of national strategies on a range of different topics. So what we did in our research was we first examined about 30 different national strategies in the US. We selected 8 of those as topics that we wanted to focus on in this report, and you can see the list here of our the strategies that we analyzed. We sort of picked the ones to focus because they were relevant to food. For example, some of these relate to health or to the environment, and we brought in a few that we wanted particularly to highlight different methods. So for example, the 9/11 Commission, sort of a different type of strategy, but it showed one that was created by legislation and had this sort of bipartisan commission, and it was a really interesting model. And again, our idea here was to show what are the tools we already have to create something like this. I think the other thing I'll point out that's really interesting is just in the past few years since we were doing this research, there were over a dozen new national food strategies launched in the US. So we didn't get to look at them because we were already midway through, but things like the National Cybersecurity Strategy, the National Drug Control Strategy on the opioid crisis, the National Strategy to promote the health of honeybees and pollinators. So there's, many, many more, even the Cancer Moonshot, which isn't called a national strategy, but if you look at the elements of it, which I'll kind of go through in a minute, it has many of the elements of these other national strategies. So again, I think just like we saw from looking at the international models, we can see that there's examples of other issues in the US where we've decided this is important, we need to get organized, we need to set goals so that we can achieve them. Often for many of these, they also share a similarity with food in that there are several different agencies that would play a role, and so it's really coordinating amongst those agencies. So let me talk you through a little bit what we can learn from these different strategies. And some of this is somewhat similar to the findings from the international examples, but these were, as we went through all the strategies and we started organizing our findings, these were the main things we examined. So as the first one was looking at the impetus for the strategy. And again, none of these are really about food, so it's less relevant for the the subject matter, but also helpful to think about what are the ways that you draw, like push government to act in certain cases. So for some of these, the impetus was a national crisis. I already mentioned the 9/11 Commission very clearly came from a national emergency. But what we learned was others actually came just from organizing of dedicated community members and activists. And I'll talk in a few minutes a little more about the HIV/AIDS strategy, which is a really great example. And that was actually just created by community activism and people coming together saying, we want this, signing on to it, and really keeping the pressure on to get it achieved during the Obama administration. The next thing we looked at was the enacting document. And you can see here a few examples of what that could be. So we spent a little bit of time thinking about whether it was something done by the executive branch, so by the president or the agencies acting on their own, or by legislation. And there's really, going back to the main ones we examined, there's quite a mix between those of how they were structured. And there's definitely some trade-offs between the two. There's legislation typically can be longer lasting, but also more difficult to pass. And often an executive order might go away at the end of one administration or might take on a new focus, but it's also more, can be more quick, and just often the president saying, I want these agencies to coordinate around this issue. We next looked at the organizing authority, and we looked at just what does this strategy entail? I mean, obviously it's one thing to say we care about this issue, but who is actually getting together and making sure that we have a plan in place? And so this could be a lot of different groups. Often there would be an executive office. So for example, with HIV/AIDS, there's an office within the executive, the Office of National AIDS Policy, that leads that. Many of them have an interagency working group, and I think this is a great model to think about for food, because this is a way to bring together many of those different agencies. And often advisory councils are another tool which brings in outside expertise. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about our recommendations. Many of the strategies use various tools to gather information. And in fact, I think this is also really great learning for food, because there's a lot of opinions out there, a lot of different stakeholders, different challenges, and there's ways to use listening sessions, surveys, comment periods, that kind of thing, to make sure that the strategy isn't just happening behind closed doors, but in fact getting opportunities for people to give input into those. And then the written strategy is another shared commonality amongst these. And what that means is that, often the goal of this organizing body is to agree on some goals and actually put them out into writing. So it could be as limited as just a list of goals. Here are 5 goals that we have. Often it will include some sort of roadmap or, action elements of how we're going to achieve those goals. So for example, the Climate Action Plan, which was one we looked at, had a specific goal in the written strategy of cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 17% over 2005 levels. So there's variation there in what the written strategy looks like and how detailed it is. The other interesting thing is some of the strategies actually required all of the different agencies to do their own written strategy to reach the overall goal. So as an example, there's a group called the Environmental Justice Interagency Working Group, which aims to increase environmental justice across different agencies. And the work of that is really within each agency setting a plan of how they're going to meet that goal. And lastly, the process for ongoing reporting. And this really looks at, how can we make sure we're meeting those goals, having progress reports, updates. Some of the strategies actually were updated. For example, the HIV/AIDS strategy, there's an update written 5 years afterwards. So there's lots of ways that that can be done. But again, accountability, making sure you're actually meeting the goals that are set out. So I want to talk really a little bit about 2 examples, and then I'll turn to some of our recommendations and some of that information. But I mentioned already a lot this national HIV/AIDS strategy. And part of the reason I've mentioned it so much is that it's, I think, one of the best models in terms of including a lot of different elements that we think are strong elements of a national strategy. So for example, in terms of organizing authority, there's few different elements. There's an executive office, which I mentioned previously, the Office of National AIDS Policy. So that means there's actually staff that are, there's a director, there's staff every day that are thinking about this and trying to move the needle forward. There's also the President's Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, which is external experts. They meet quarterly and they give input on the strategy. They write recommendations and think about how we're going to move the needle and take the next steps. And that brings in a lot of outside expertise from around the country. There's also an interagency working group that brings in different agencies. The National HIV/AIDS Strategy did a great job of soliciting public input. So as you can see, they had community discussions across the country and had over 4,000 participants in those discussions and over 1,000 written submissions. So this, I think, is a great example of how they were able to get out and get a lot of different opinions. And in fact, there was so much public input that in addition to publishing the national strategy, there was also a separate document called Community Ideas for Improving the Response to the Domestic HIV Epidemic, which was a separate report that highlighted some of the models and examples that different participants brought up that were more applicable to like local best practices. They weren't things that made sense in a national strategy, but because there was so much input, they wanted to really capture those great ideas. And I think it also helped participants to feel really heard. And then lastly, reporting and accountability. There's an annual progress report created for the strategy. And then after the first strategy came out in 2010, in 2015, it was actually updated because of so many of the goals had been met, and also because there was new science, there were new treatments like exposure prophylaxis had come out in that interim. So it was updated to address some of these new changing conditions. And once again, they went around, they got the public input, et cetera. The one other thing I want to highlight about the National HIV/AIDS Strategy is the impetus, the sort of creation of it. So leading up to the 2008 presidential election, HIV and AIDS activists really wanted to get this on the national radar, and they wrote a white paper called Blueprint for a National HIV/AIDS Strategy, which we learned after we had called our project Blueprint for a National Food Strategy. But if we can be as successful as them, I'm happy to be linked with that. So they put up a website, they had thousands of people sign on, and they got it in front of actual candidates that were running for president. So all of the Democratic candidates signed on and said that they would launch a national HIV/AIDS strategy if elected. And then after McCain became the Republican nominee, he also committed to enact a national HIV/AIDS strategy. So this kind of happened. The first strategy was launched in 2010, a couple years after the election. So I think that's a great example that is helpful for us as food advocates and activists to remember that really, people can come together and push something like this and really have success. I want to talk briefly about another national strategy that is completely different, and I think that's why I think it's a great thing to pair with the National HIV/AIDS Strategy. So this is the National Environmental Policy Act, and this, as you can tell by the word act, perhaps was created by legislation. And the idea behind this is that it's a procedural statute. And what it does is it requires that government agencies, when they are undertaking major federal action, they have to analyze the impact of that action on the environment. So there's sort of a little chart here, this little tree that shows significant impact. And what that question is will this federal action have a significant impact on the environment? So there's some things that are categorically excluded from the requirement of NEPA. If the impact is unclear or they're unsure, they have to at least do a preliminary environmental assessment. And then if that shows that there'll be a lot of impact, they have to do an environmental impact statement. So it's an interesting model because it doesn't require the agency to do anything different. They could still go about doing whatever they're going to do, even if they find that there'll be harm to the environment. But it does often make them change just by thinking about the environment in those actions. And in fact, in the environmental impact statement, they have to list out reasonable alternatives to the proposed plan of action and explain why they didn't do any of those. So I think there is some argument that this does, it certainly makes the environment be taken into account and does often actually change the proposed course of action. And also the public has to be allowed to comment on the environmental impact statement. And so the picture here is actually a meeting that took place in Navajo Nation regarding proposed fracking that needed a NEPA review. So you can see, people were brought together and were able to give input. And we thought this was a really interesting model to look at because it is so different. I'll say one weakness of something like this is that there's no way to change existing laws. So NEPA isn't used to review statutes that have been on the books or something like that. It is required to review new agency actions going forward. So there's sort of a piece of it that, to the extent we think we have laws on the books that we'd want to open up and review again, those aren't really on the table using this legislation. And the other interesting thing about NEPA that is, I think, relevant in the case of food is that part of the reason behind creating it was that there was Senator Henry Jackson was sort of at that time looking at a lot of activities taking place in the Everglades in Florida and realized that there were 3 different federal agencies that were trying to do development within the Everglades in totally different ways. The Department of the Interior wanted more land for a national park. The Army Corps of Engineers was trying to acquire land in the Everglades, the same parcels of land for agriculture. And then the Department of Transportation was about to develop an airport there. And, seeing all of these different things and realizing so much governmental energy was going into conflicting priorities and plans with no method for organizing those together was really an impetus behind this. And I think we certainly, going back to the slide that Lori showed of all the different agencies involved with food, we can see how there's a similar issue. So let me talk a little bit about our findings and recommendations. The first finding and recommendation is that we could really benefit from a national food strategy. And I will say that we came into this project open to the fact that we might wind up in another direction. We really just wanted to examine what was out there and see if this would be beneficial. But I think based on everything we read, based on the interviews we conducted with many thought leaders around the country, we thought that really having some sort of strategy could both reduce administrative redundancy, increase coordination around the food system, just identify and address the trade-offs that were going on within legislation or regulation. Some of the examples Lori showed where things might be in tension with one another, and maybe most importantly, improve food, health, and environmental outcomes. So then within our findings and recommendations, because we were so focused on the process of creating a national food strategy and how others were created, we didn't recommend that the strategy should deal with one issue or another, but instead we really focused on the way that it should be created, what elements should be included, and we organized those under these 4 headings: coordination, participation, transparency and accountability, and durability. So I'll talk through those in a little more detail to give you a sense of where we wound up. So I think the biggest one perhaps is that a national food strategy should have, as a very core piece of it, this element of coordination. And again, this goes back to this issue that there are so many different agencies, so many different actors making decisions right now. So we thought first that there should be some sort of lead office or agency. Again, this is because there's so many actors, so having someone to really organize, but then also having an interagency working group to make sure that all those 15 different agencies or more that are regulating things that impact food are at the table making decisions together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of what's missing right now. And then another piece of this is to engage other actors like state, local, and tribal actors, and make sure that a national food strategy isn't trying to be top down or quash some of the experiments and developments going on at the state and local and tribal level, but instead figure out what those are, how to keep room and space for them, and really just make sure at the federal level that we have the kinds of laws and regulations that are promoting the best outcomes where federal law is at issue. This is participation, and this is really goes back to some of the examples like the Brazil example, the HIV/AIDS example that we've talked about. And I think what we've seen is the strongest strategies really did an amazing job of engaging the public. So I think there's kind of 2 main ways that we would do this. One is by using an advisory council like the HIV/AIDS advisory council that I mentioned, which is a great way to bring in experts from a variety of backgrounds, make sure food producers are at the table, make sure people from diverse racial backgrounds are at the table, and make sure different parts of the country are represented. And I think this is, really a great way to get those voices there and help making those decisions. And then secondly, making sure that there's a really great way to get public input. And I'll talk a little more sort of at the end about some other ideas related to this, but just, we don't need to guess at what consumers or what people want. We should give them an opportunity to say what they want and say what their priorities are. And lastly, responding to that input. So nothing feels worse than giving input and not being heard. And hopefully all of you who are giving questions in chat will feel heard at the end of this when we respond to those. But making sure that that input is accumulated and kind of accounted for, and that responses are made when things aren't when suggestions aren't taken. Transparency and accountability, and this is what it sounds like. How do we make this more open to people so they understand what's going on? And I think one of the biggest things here is having a written strategy. So this obviously does take time to get to that written strategy, but one of I think the biggest weaknesses right now facing the food system is that there's so much that's not really written down. So it's not clear what our policy goals are for the food system. Is it just that our food is safe and affordable? I mean, those are important, but we also care about the impact on the environment or about equity. So I think kind of writing down what the goals are and our strategies to get there so that we can be on the same page, and then hold agencies and Congress accountable when they deviate from those. And then to that end as well, having publication of reports that are perhaps annual or periodic reports talking about progress. And lastly, durability, and this I think is really crucial as well. So there's 2 main pieces here. The biggest is, well, I guess one of them is just having periodic updating of the strategy. So this, harkens back to what I mentioned for the National HIV/AIDS strategy, that things might change. There might be new technology, new science, new diseases or crises that we need to be able to update a strategy and address those. So we want to kind of balance the ability also to put a strategy down and set long-term goals that we're really going to try to meet them, but also that there be updates so that as things change, those can be accounted for. And this is also a place where we could think about some sort of procedural mechanism like what I described with NEPA. I think I mentioned the weakness with NEPA is that it wouldn't affect laws already on the books, but as a way to say, we care about the food system, and going forward, when agencies make decisions, we want them to take account of how that decision might impact the food system. What will be the impact on affordability or on availability, that the environment, those kinds of things could be really helpful as a way to make better decisions going forward. So I'm now going to shift gears yet again, and I'll try to do this part a little more quickly, but I wanted to bring in another piece, which, as we've worked on this report for nearly 2 years, there was an election in the middle of our work, and the political climate changed a fair amount. So Lori Beirenevend and I worked over the fall and early this spring on a follow-up article, and I'll give you the site to that at the end of this, but just looking at, even in the current political climate, there are a lot of reasons to think that a national food strategy really meets our goals. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the main examples that we highlight in this article, and I think that this is still relevant. It didn't, it's not going away, but there are things that right now could keep this on our radar. So the first is around reducing inefficiencies, and this was, I think, a big message in the, of the Trump campaign within this election, primarily around reducing regulations and reducing inefficiency in regulation. And so what's so interesting here is that the Government Accountability Office actually did a report to Congress last year saying there are a lot of opportunities to be more efficient about our regulations. So they looked at 544 actions over 200 different areas and fields, and food and agriculture was a main one that they brought out and said, that there could be more efficiency by addressing fragmented, overlapping programs, et cetera. And in fact, earlier this year, the GAO also itself called for a national food safety strategy. So they clearly also agree that there's some problems here where agencies are stepping on each other's toes, and it's a waste, and also there might be things that are being missed along the way. So this is interesting because a lot of the other strategies that we examined, both globally and domestically, had as their stated goal was reducing inefficiencies. So as you can see here, this little NEPA icon, remember back to the example of the Everglades, when we have 3 agencies that have different priorities for one area and are stepping on each other's toes, wasting time, doing plans, hiring consultants, whatever it is, and they're not coordinated, that's not efficient. And then just as another example, you heard earlier about the UK, and one of their big goals for their strategy was to increase efficiency and find ways that many different agencies that were working on different issues could share resources, do joint research, etc. Another big theme, I think, of this election, and certainly of the past, I'd say 5-10 years, has been the economy. So voters in the last election ranked the economy as the #1 issue, regardless of which way they voted. So that's really interesting. So you can see agriculture contributed about $835 billion to the GDP. So it's not a huge amount of total GDP, but still sizable. And then about 10% of total employment in the US is within the food system. And you can see here a little map, a pie chart of where that, where those jobs are. But certainly this is a huge employer. And then also households spend between 8 to 34% of their income on food. So, and with the most low income households spending the highest proportion of their income on food. So there's certainly a household level economic component to this as well, and a reason that people who are caring about the economy, or are concerned about their finances, and food should play a role within that. And the other interesting piece behind this is that in many of the different strategies that were created that focused on food and the economy, so some of them were really about exports and trade and global competitiveness, but some of them also looked at the economy in terms of the cost of diet-related disease and poor health as a result of the food system. So at the state level, as an example, Minnesota created a food plan that one of the points they highlighted in it was that they could save $11 billion per year in diet-related healthcare costs just by rethinking some of the elements of their food system. So I think it's a really good example that there's a lot of ways that food and economic development intertwine. And then lastly, connecting communities with policymaking. And there was, I think, this real perception and feeling of disconnect in the last election, particularly amongst rural voters, and this feeling that there's policymakers in Washington or maybe in their state capital who are making laws but are really disconnected from some of the struggles that they're facing. And this is true, on lots of issues, but I think food is a really great example of an issue where 100% of people participate in the food system because they buy food and they eat. And yet it's very difficult to know when decision making around food is happening because it's going on across so many different, the legislature and so many different agencies. But it's a way that people can be involved. It's easy to understand, and at the very least sort of say what their goals are and what their priorities are for what they're eating. So, again, there are a lot of different strategies. I go back to the National HIV/AIDS strategy as one domestically that we thought did an amazing job of bringing in that external input. And, I think there's Brazil as well, which Lori mentioned. This to me is really crucial. And I think the other point is that there's some viewpoints that are really not represented at the federal level in terms of, there are very few representatives and senators who are farmers. There are some, but not many. There's very few that came from backgrounds where they weren't able to afford food. And so there's a lot of other expertise and ideas that we could bring in if we make sure to make this open for participation. So just going to end with, leave you with one thought. And I know, I don't know if we got to do the first poll, but maybe we could do our second poll right now if Yona could set that up. So the idea here is, I think based on everything we looked at and learned, we realized that creating a national food strategy really makes more sense if the government is endorsing it, is bought into it, and is working on this strategy. But on the same time, it might be that in this administration or in this political climate, this isn't something that we're going to see happen from the government. So we spent some time, especially in our article, looking at the People's Food Strategy model from Canada. And so the way this was created was done through nonprofit organization and engaging a lot of public opinion. They engage about 3,500 people, primarily through these kitchen table talks, which were kind of community dialogues in neighborhoods where people came together and talked about what they wanted to see, what their goals were for food strategy for Canada. And it turned into this People's Food Policy, which has been, I think, pretty successful. And what's most interesting about it is that because of this strategy, there was also an agriculture industry strategy created, but the Trudeau administration last year actually committed to create a Canadian food strategy from the government level. And I think this really shows the impact of citizen activists to really put something on the government agenda. So I will leave here for a moment, just again, food strategy blueprint will show you the report. As Lori mentioned, there's ways to give input within the report itself. You can answer questions. We would love, please do that. Please share it with others. And then also there's a little a box on this page that shows the article I mentioned. So that last bit about this, the current administration is really from that article and why this could still be really important. And I wanted to say something about the poll results, but they seem to have disappeared from my screen. So I don't know how to see those again, but maybe when I turn it over, if, okay, thanks. I don't know what you guys did. So if the US adopted a national food strategy, should the government lead the process? So we had a lot of people saying no, which I think is really interesting. I'm excited actually to talk more in the Q&A and then also to, be talking with many of you again on the video conference. And really, if you have ideas or thoughts, and we want to engage with more people about this. So we're really happy to talk with you and hear from you. So lastly, let me just put it on the question slide. And I think one last thing I'll say, I want to thank again the Chesapeake Foodshed group and also Kellogg, who supported, Kellogg Foundation, who supported our report. And then thanks as well to the many people that we interviewed and interacted with along the way that gave us really great insight and input as we were creating this report.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing with us your hard work and great research and thoughtfulness. That was really wonderful. We've been collecting your questions. Please continue to post them, and I'll now moderate the Q&A session. If we don't get through all of them, we will share the unanswered questions with the presenters for their review and some for discussion in the follow-up regional video conference on June 26th. So I guess to build off that poll question, there was a juicy one in the Q&A box about with lack of federal leadership, how can this blueprint be adjusted for a bottom-up approach? For example, knitting together the many localized food policy councils from cities and regions.
I'm happy to answer. I don't know, Lori, if you want to go first to give your 2 cents, because I was talking about the article a little.
Sure. I mean, I think, as Emily said, when we started working on this project originally, I think our approach to it was, this is going to be an advocacy tool towards pushing government into creating a national food strategy. And the election sort of like threw everything for a loop. But it helped us think about the issue in a different way, and to think about our report in a different way, which is why we wound up creating the article that we did. And I think at the end of that article, I mean, it's pretty heavy. It's a law review article. I don't know that all of you are going to go out and like be really excited to read it necessarily. But one of the things that we say at the end of that is that, you know, there are a lot of reasons for the government right now to think about creating a national food strategy. And those reasons speak to some of the priorities of this administration. That's not to say that people will necessarily trust in the administration to do that, or that the administration will have the level of transparency that people feel comfortable with. But there are certain attributes to a national food strategy that can address, exactly as Emily said, reducing inefficiencies, promoting economic development, helping to support rural communities. All of those things are things that can be accomplished with a national food strategy. The other sort of piece of that, or the other conclusion that we came to at the end of our article was, if the government isn't interested in doing that, then citizens should sort of start gearing up towards the next election cycle. And in the meantime, look to Canada as a model, or look to other countries where the public has been really focused on advocating, and at the grassroots level, having conversations about what could these food policies look like. Develop your own plan or policy. Start having conversations about what your objectives and goals might be, and that may at some point trickle up to the federal government. But it's certainly worth starting the conversation now, whether it's going to be government-led or whether it be something that trickles up through the grassroots level, just to get people talking and thinking about what the goals and priorities are, what the process should look like, how to engage stakeholders. All of those things are certainly conversations that could be happening right now, and are happening to a certain extent.
And I'll say one tiny other thing to leave time for more questions, but I do think, like, we've worked a lot with local and regional food policy councils. I think there's so much expertise at the local level, and I'm really interested in state level, in figuring out how those voices would be involved, whether this is created at the federal level or by government, or whether, as Lori was discussing, it's kind of created at first from activists. But I think sometimes there's I think we're doing a great job pushing for policies at the state and local level with those groups, and it has felt really difficult to figure out how do we pull all those together and have a kind of unified front at the national level. So hopefully this will start, driving some of that excitement too.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Another question fairly related to where we are heading with those answers. What is the best way for existing networks or coalitions like the Chesapeake Foodshed Network, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, et cetera, to engage with and or support the national food strategy beyond having a representative on the advisory council?
That's such a good question. I mean, I will say actually one reason we were really, I don't want to speak for Lori, but you can interrupt me if I'm wrong, but we were excited to do this is we, kind of put this report out. Again, it was a different administration, different climate than when we started. And so we've been trying to figure out what do we do next. So I'm excited actually to talk more, particularly on the video conference, and get ideas about are there things we can also do to build a hub for people to start to come together and talk about this. I keep going back to this example from the People's Food Strategy and from the HIV/AIDS strategy here, where it was really, putting something up, people rallied around it, and kind of was incredibly successful at getting the ideas out there, bringing people together. And I think it's also a good kind of call to action for us in the food, working in the food system, that there are a lot of tensions. There are places where people have competing visions, and finding opportunities for us to get to the core of what people agree on, and be able to get that out in front of decision makers.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I see in the notes and comments or in the chat feature that people have been talking about the People's Food Policy in Canada, and that process I think is really instructive, or can be really instructive in the United States. There were 3,500 people I think that were engaged. There were over 350 discussions that happened at the local and community level. And so if people are interested in starting those conversations, they certainly could begin having those conversations, whether they be as informal as sitting around somebody's kitchen table, actually, or literally, or whether it be that sort of local government starts to assemble places and opportunities for people to start having these conversations and talk about what their goals and priorities are, and start agreeing on places where they think they can agree, as Emily suggested.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we're running short on time as usual with these kinds of discussions, but we've got some really, really important questions that we haven't been able to get to. So please join us on June 26th for a video conference where we'll have a lot more time to dig into questions and have more of a discussion based on this report and all of the conversations that it's influenced. So I will share too that some of you may know the CFN is launching a policy program in the region for networking, mutual support, and education. So events like this are fitting into that. And ultimately, we're hoping that this can lead to more movement building and organizing around good food policy in the Chesapeake, again, including DC, Delaware, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. We've heard from you that affecting policy change at the local, state, and national levels is a top priority, and it's especially timely given the national political situation. Our immediate priority is connecting leaders across states to weave a peer-to-peer learning network. So the video conference in just a couple of weeks will be a great way to do some of that. And no matter what your role, if you're engaged with or interested in food policy work across the region, please join us. I invite you to email me with any questions or suggestions. You can even use the chat box here to chat your email address, and I'll follow up. We'll continue to provide you networking and learning opportunities this summer and fall. So with that, thank you so much again, Emily, Lori, and Emma. And what a great stage you've set for positive change and coordinated action and learning for us. And now I'll pass it back to Yona to close the webinar. Thank you all so much again, and thank you to our great participants.
I will just echo all of those thanks. It's a lot of food for thought. Sorry, I couldn't resist, but you've set us up for some great conversations. Hope to see many of you at the video conference in a couple of weeks. Again, part of the Coffee Talk platform is to identify ways for people to be connected and engaged after the webinar. And so we have a couple of resources that we're posting here, invitation to follow up at the video conference. And I imagine that out of that, some further next steps will emerge. Encourage you to sign up on ChesapeakeFoodshed.net for the CFN's Hive, which is a bi-monthly, every 2 weeks resource guide of all the happenings, most of the happenings across the Chesapeake. and other policy-related initiatives and events that are coming up. We also have some upcoming CFN events. Later on this month, we'll have a webinar, and then into July, a follow-up video conference on farm to hospitals. On August 1st, we have a webinar supporting beginning and new farmers on accessing training and support. Everyone is welcome. If you're interested in participating in Coffee Talks, if you have resources to share, please be in touch. The network is growing, and we need your support to grow. One more final huge thanks to Lori and Emily and Emma. Thank you so much. We're really grateful to have worked with you this far, and really looking forward to the video conference to dig in deeper into what you've laid out for us today. So thank you so much. We're going to end here. Hope everybody has a wonderful day, and we'll see you again at another event. Thank you so much. Okay, so